So, a farmer went out to sow seed. Sounds like a fairly simple beginning, doesn't it? A phrase that the people in Jesus' audience would have warmed to, for they knew about sowing seeds. Some of them still lived on their own farms in Galilee, carefully tending the land they had inherited, nurturing the small flocks of goats and sheep that provided wool and cheese and yogurt, along with fertility for their land, carefully planting the leeks and the garlic, the cucumbers and the beans, the barley and the wheat that made up their crops. There were no tomatoes at this point in the Middle East. They lovingly nurtured the almond, the fig, and apricot trees that provided them with dried fruit and nut meats to eat throughout the winter months. Others had lost their land, but they still knew about sowing because they were the ones that the rich landowners sent out to do the sowing and the weeding and the harvesting, either as hired laborers or as slaves. They knew all about sowing, and they knew what was necessary before sowing could happen. They knew that the farmer needed to be deeply familiar with the soil to assess its fertility. They knew that fertility was a constantly shifting state, that fertile fields could be depleted and would need a rest, a fallow season, or the grazing of flocks to recover. They knew that poor soil could improve if plant matter and manure was added. So every year, the farmer needed to reach back into her memory and think of the story of her land. Did it need a rest this year? Did it need more nutrients from grazing animals? Or was it ready once more for seed? And the farmer needed to discern how much seed was needed for each field, each small area of fertility that she depended on for food. These were not big farms. They were small plots of land in between the trees. Seed wasted could mean hungry bellies in winter. Seed wasted was for many a matter of life and death. Which is why Jesus' story about the farmer was on the one hand utterly familiar, and on the other hand deeply puzzling. I mean, what kind of farmer is so lacking in discernment that she sows seeds on the pathway, packed hard by the feet of sheep and goats, where there is no loose soil for the seeds to nestle into? Laying out in full sight, such seeds are easily seen and eaten by the birds. What kind of farmer is so lacking in discernment that she sows her seeds on the rocky soil, where there's not enough depth for roots to develop, so that the plants will be unable to withstand sun and drought? I mean, what kind of farmer is so lacking in discernment that she sows her seeds amongst the thorns that will shade the plants and crowd them out? It could be argued that the only part of the story that makes sense is the portion of seed that was sown onto the good, fertile soil, where a good crop could be expected. This is what responsible farming is all about. Though even there, what Jesus says about the harvest of that seed is a little puzzling, because he said the return is 100-fold or 60 or 30-fold. Whereas in ancient Palestine at this time, the return was 7-fold, 10-fold, not much more than that. So maybe that's the only responsible part of the story, or maybe not. The farmer's careless sowing habits seem deeply puzzling to those who only think of farming as a simple input-output equation. Sow your seed in the place of maximum fertility and harvest as much crop as you can. It's a paradigm that has shaped industrial agriculture in the present, as well as the agriculture practiced by the great empires for centuries. And it's a way of thinking that can only lead to destruction. What if Jesus is reflecting a way of farming that is concerned not just with the returns of one season, but the long-term fertility of the land on which the farmer dwells. What if the farmer is making some seed available for the birds so that the birds would be drawn to her land? And perhaps while they're there, they would also eat some of the insects that are eating her crops. I practice this. What if the seed that the birds scooped up from the path were to be pooped out, encased in a little packet of fertility, to perhaps grow into an unexpected harvest in unexpected places? Perhaps Jesus is suggesting a way of farming where the plants that wither and die in the thin, rocky soil will decompose in that soil, slowly adding fertility and depth and nutrients so that the rocky soil will one day be able to actually nourish plants for a season. What if Jesus is reminding the people that the thorn bushes draw nutrients to the topsoil with their deep, strong roots, but the thorn bushes shade the soil so that it doesn't dry out? What if Jesus is reminding them that the plant matter from the seeds that tried to grow up under the thorns and then wilted will also add texture and fertility to the soil, so that when the animals eventually graze down the thorns, which is what the goats would do in the first century, when they do that and add their own fertility to the ground, the land is renewed and a small patch of good soil is created for good growth once again. What if Jesus is suggesting that planting for such a renewal is deeply important because fertility is fragile? After all farmers know that continuing to merely sow in what is now good soil will deplete it quickly. We learn this the hard way. The farmer needs to think, by we I mean like me personally, on our farm. The farmer needs to think about the future of her land, the future of her farm, the possibilities for renewal in the places that are barren and currently unproductive. The farmer needs to be able to imagine healing, restoration, and renewal for the land. And a good farmer knows that such healing and restoration can only happen in relationship with the birds, with the plants, with the animals with whom she shares her place. She knows that such restoration only happens if she creates the possibility for other creatures to contribute to that healing, and she sows her seeds widely in hope of that renewal. Now, even if some farmers had understood what Jesus was saying here, and I think that those listening to Jesus did know that the depletion and renewal of the soil was a constant and fluid process. Ancient authors in the first century write about this a lot, actually. Even so, this way of planting would have been seen as a luxury. Yes, the long-term health of the land is important, but who has extra seed to entice the birds? Who can afford to grow plants that will only enrich the soil when the Romans have driven you into debt and you need every single seed that is sown to pay that debt back? Who can afford to sow for the birds when every seed needs to bear a crop in order for hunger to be fed? For those in precarious circumstances, Jesus' story was an idyllic plan for the wealthy, not the practical reality of those who grew up during times of famine and hardship. Just like organic food or buying locally grown food is out of reach for many people in precarious circumstances in our context, right? That's better for the land, but that's for the wealthy. But there's another reason why this story about the farmer might have been puzzling to those who had come to hear Jesus. Most of those listening to Jesus had not abandoned their daily work to go out to the lake to hear Jesus talk about farming. They knew about farming. They were concerned about God returning to their land. They were concerned about the ongoing occupation of their land by Roman soldiers. They were wondering when God would return, kick out the Romans, and overturn the injustices that had been done to them. You know that old joke about what happens when you play a country and western song? When you play it backwards, you get your wife back, you get your dog back, you get your truck back. Well, the people who followed Jesus to the lake that day were hoping for something like that. They wanted their land back. They wanted their freedom back. They wanted their children back. And they wanted their God back. They wanted God to come live in their midst again. Because when God came, those who were sick would be healed. Those who were hungry would be fed. Their land would be restored to them. Now, Jesus had been proclaiming that God's new community had arrived among them, and they were expecting Jesus to give them a plan, teach them about how that community would come. And instead, they got a short story about farming, just like you came to church to hear somebody talk about Jesus or Romans or maybe even Jacob and Esau, and you're getting a short story about farming. The disciples are clearly puzzled, and so probably was the crowd. And I think some of you are too. In the verses that our reading skipped today, the disciples asked Jesus what the heck he's talking about. Why all these parables? And as part of his response, he's got a longish response, Jesus explains what he was saying in this little story about the farmer. First of all, the seed on the path, he tells them, represents those who do not understand. Those who do not understand Jesus' message about God's new community. And so the evil one snatches away the seed that was planted in their hearts. There were people like this within Mark's gospel. The religious leaders seem to be the ones who consistently do not understand what Jesus is saying. And so the seed has no chance to take root in their hearts. The second batch of seed falls on the rocky ground. This is those with great enthusiasm for Jesus' message. But when the time of trials and persecutions come, they stumble, unable to continue to walk in the way of Jesus. Does that sound familiar? The disciples followed Jesus with enthusiasm, though often with a lack of understanding. But when danger arose, along with a threat of arrest, they fell away and disappeared. The third batch of seed falls in the thorns. This is those who hear Jesus' message, but anxiety and wealth exert such a powerful pull on their lives, they're not able to fulfill Jesus' calling. We meet people like that too, right? The rich man who was unable to sell all that he had to come and follow Jesus. And fourth, the good soil is those who hear Jesus' message, who understand what it means for their lives, bear the fruit of healing and restoration, of forgiveness and new life, more than anyone could imagine. 4 sets of seeds, 4 types of soil, representing 4 types of people and circumstances. It seems pretty straightforward. But if we read this interpretation in light of the agricultural practices that I just outlined, the agricultural practices of the parable itself, something else should be apparent. None of these types of soil are fixed. The actions of the birds, the thorns, even of the dying plants, all work together to restore fertility. And so it is with the interpretation. None of these types of people are slotted into their place with no chance of transformation. Some of those hard-hearted religious leaders become central in proclaiming the message of Jesus' new life. One of those was the Apostle Paul. And the disciples who fell away in the times of trial become the core of the new community that provides for those in need, that prays together, that brings resurrection hope of Jesus to all whom they encounter. And even some of those who seem at first to have been choked out by anxiety and wealth, think of Zacchaeus, engage in radical acts of restoration that shape a community of welcome and hope. All of these groups end up being part of the fertility and abundance that are found in the community shaped by Jesus. In comparing his message and the circumstances in which it is heard to seed and soil, Jesus is using a living metaphor, a metaphor that is pregnant with new life, a metaphor that means fertility and new life are always a possibility, no matter how infertile or unreceptive the circumstances might be. After all, the secret soil is that things die and become the compost of new life. Just like we serve a God whose specialty is bringing new life, resurrection out of death. And if you need any more evidence that this is the pattern of the parable, our reading from Genesis, the struggle of Jacob and Esau, proves it. There's a lot to say about this passage. I thought about 4 sermons on this passage. Really interesting thing, this is a complete aside, is that Esau is this like man's man, this hairy man, he likes to hunt. And Jacob, it says, had smooth skin like a woman, and he liked to hang out in the tents and cook with the women. So right away, you've got this hint that Jacob's going to be a little bit unusual, right? He doesn't follow the gender patterns, the normal cultural gender patterns of the ancient world. Unfortunately, he's also a little bit of a jerk. He doesn't seem to be the fertile soil in which God's new community will be formed. He's conniving, he's a plotter, he seems to have the ambition of Macbeth. And yet, after running away and living elsewhere for most of his adult life, he's the one who wrestles with God in the wilderness. We'll read about that in a couple weeks. He's the one who comes home to make peace with his brother Esau. He's the one through whom God's community is formed. In fact, all of these stories we've been reading in Genesis, which are snapshots of one of the most dysfunctional family units, and this dysfunction is passed down from generation to generation, all of these stories show how God's hopes for restoration and newness continue to be realized. No matter how screwed up or messed up or broken the people are that God is working with. They appear to be soil that can never bear fruit, but God has other ideas. And this, of course, is what the parable of the sower is about. Jesus was surrounded by people that no one, least of all themselves, expected to be the fruit-bearing soil of a new community. A bunch of rough fishermen, tax collectors who had collaborated with the Romans, people with mental health problems, people with various physical ailments, some of them debilitating, those who had lived shameful lives, and those who were too respectable to be of any use to those in need. Just as bad. Those who were very, very poor, and those who had lost their land and their hope. Those who had enough money to support Jesus and his followers. Those who longed for restoration and newness, but thought it could never come for them. Jesus is saying to them all, and to us, the seed of God's new word of hope has landed on you all. Perhaps you're the ones whose soil is so hard that you're unable to grasp that word now. Perhaps you can't imagine how to follow Jesus in the midst of all your other challenges. Perhaps you are so worried about housing or rent or food or your health or broken relationships. We've all been there. That these things choke out energy for figuring out what following Jesus looks like. And in the midst of that, Jesus is saying this, listen, you are part of a community, part of an ecosystem of faith. There are others around you who are feeding your soil, and others whom you feed. And out of the detritus of our lives together, out of the compost of our struggles, fertility will come. Welcome, abundance, and hope. More fruitfulness than we can ask or imagine. Amen.